Sir, first class isn't for everyone. People like you should sit in the back. That was the sentence that froze the entire cabin. The lead flight attendant's voice was sharp, loud enough for everyone to hear, and you could almost feel the air leave the room. Before we dive into what happened next, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if this story shocks you, hit like and subscribe now. Let's go back to that spring day on Horizon Airlines Flight 214, traveling from JFK to Los Angeles, when one man's dignity collided head-on with prejudice at 30,000 feet. I was there that day, sitting just a few rows behind first class, and I saw everything unfold with my own eyes. His name was Richard Taylor, a quiet man in his mid-50s, dressed in a sharp gray suit and polished black shoes, carrying nothing but a slim briefcase and a calm presence. No one knew it yet. But Richard wasn't just another passenger. He was the CEO of Horizon Airlines and owned 10% of the company. But that morning, he looked like any other traveler, and that's exactly why what happened next spiraled out of control. Richard settled into seat 1A, scrolling through his tablet, preparing for a board meeting in Los Angeles where he planned to propose new routes serving underserved communities, including the one where he grew up. The first-class cabin buzzed with the usual chaos of boarding. Bags stuffed into overhead bins, people arguing over space, flight attendants rushing up and down the aisle. That's when Mary Smith appeared, the lead flight attendant, her clipboard clutched tightly like a weapon. She'd been with Horizon for 15 years, known for her sharp tongue and her way of treating wealthy passengers like royalty while dismissing anyone who didn't look the part. Trailing behind her was Nancy Hernandez, younger, less experienced, clearly eager to copy Mary's every move. Then came Lisa Wilson, a wealthy real estate investor dripping in diamonds, carrying a $5,000 Gucci handbag like it was made of gold. She stopped right in front of Richard's seat, her bag swinging inches from his arm, and said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "Excuse me, this bag needs its own seat." Mary swooped in immediately, smiling at Lisa with the kind of warmth reserved only for platinum members. "Of course. Ms. Wilson." "We'll take care of it," she said, glancing toward Richard. That's when Lisa, without hesitation, pointed at him and said, "He can move to economy. I'll pay him $400 to give up his seat." The cabin went silent. Passengers nearby froze, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Richard looked up slowly, his expression calm but unshakable. "This is my seat," he said evenly, holding up his boarding pass. "First class, 1A. Mary barely looked at it. "Sir, Miss Wilson is one of our Platinum Elite members. We're just asking for a little cooperation. There's a seat available in row 25. Middle. It's only 5 hours." Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "I paid $2,500 for this seat. I'm not moving." That's when Nancy stepped in, her tone sharper than it should have been. "Sir, don't make this difficult. First class isn't for everyone." Those words hung in the air like a thunderclap. I remember hearing gasps around me, Brian Allen and Eric Green, two black tech entrepreneurs seated nearby. Exchanged stunned looks, Brian whispered. "This is wrong." "I'm recording." His phone was up in seconds, capturing every word, every expression. Mary leaned in closer, lowering her voice but making sure it carried just enough to sound authoritative. "Sir, you're holding up boarding. Either move to economy or we'll have to call airport security." Richard didn't flinch. He met her gaze and said quietly, "Call them." Lisa rolled her eyes and laughed, shaking her head. "Why are you being so stubborn? $400 is probably more than you make in a week." That line hit hard, and you could feel the entire cabin shift. A few passengers turned to stare at Lisa, their faces a mix of shock and disgust. Richard didn't take the bait. He calmly reached for his phone, dialed a number, and said into the receiver, "Anthony, it's Richard. I'm on Flight 214. and we've got a situation here. On the other end was Anthony Garcia, Richard's trusted assistant, who immediately started making calls. Meanwhile, Brian's recording was already live on TikTok, his caption blunt and furious. Flight attendant tells black man first class isn't for him. Unreal. Comments began pouring in within minutes. This is disgusting. Name and shame the airline. Not surprised, but still outraged. While chaos brewed online, the tension inside the cabin reached a boiling point. Mary stepped back, clearly rattled by Richard's composure, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to remove you from this flight." That's when Richard said something that made me sit up straight. "I'd like to speak to the captain," he said, his voice low but commanding, the kind of tone that carried authority without needing to raise volume. Mary scoffed. "The captain's busy preparing for takeoff. You need to do as you're told." From a few seats back, Brian muttered under his breath. "They have no idea who they're talking to." Eric, still typing furiously on his phone, glanced up and whispered, "They're about to find out." The cabin was silent except for the hum of the engines and the faint tapping of fingers on screens as more passengers started recording. You could feel the tension building, a storm about to break, and in that moment, watching Richard sit there, calm as stone while chaos erupted around him, I realized something. This wasn't just about a seat, or a handbag, or even $400. This was about dignity, about being seen, about a man refusing to be diminished. None of us knew it yet. But the next 10 minutes would change everything. For Richard, for Horizon Airlines, and for everyone watching online. "Sir, you're causing a scene, and we cannot allow this to continue," Mary snapped, her voice louder now, sharp enough to slice through the chatter in the cabin. The tension was thick. You could feel the unease ripple from row to row. Richard Taylor, though, didn't flinch. He sat back in his seat, legs crossed, eyes steady, the very image of composure. But I could see the storm brewing behind that calm exterior. Mary turned to Nancy, her younger assistant, and jerked her chin toward the front. "Go get security," she ordered under her breath, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Nancy hesitated, glancing at Richard, then back at Mary. "Are you sure?" she whispered nervously, but Mary shot her a glare that made her jump. Nancy scurried down the aisle, nearly tripping over someone's bag, while murmurs broke out around us. "What's going on?" a man behind me asked his wife. She shook her head, whispering back, "I think they're trying to kick him out of first class, just 2 rows ahead." Brian Allen kept his phone steady, still filming, whispering to his friend Eric, "This video's already past 50,000 views." Eric didn't look up, his thumbs flying across his screen. "I've posted on X," he said quickly. Caption: "Flight attendant tells black man he doesn't belong in first class." It's trending already. I could hear the notification sounds going off on both their phones. This wasn't just a small disagreement anymore. It was exploding online in real time. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice low, calm, deliberate. "I'd like to speak to the captain," he said again, and this time the authority in his tone made heads turn. Mary stiffened, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "The captain is busy preparing for takeoff," she said firmly. Her lips pursed into a thin line. "You need to comply, sir, or we'll remove you from this aircraft." Lisa Wilson, perched in her designer outfit across the aisle, laughed softly, shaking her head as she pulled out a compact mirror to touch up her lipstick. "I really don't understand why this is taking so long," she said loudly, clearly wanting everyone to hear. $400 for that seat is generous. Some people just don't know their place." Her voice dripped with entitlement, and several passengers turned to glare at her, but she didn't seem to care. Richard finally looked up at her, his expression unchanging but his words sharp. Ma'am, this isn't about your bag, your money, or your assumptions about me. This is about respect, Lisa scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. But I saw her cheeks flush. Mary stepped in again, visibly frustrated now, her pride fueling every word. Sir, this is my cabin, and I am responsible for its operation. If you don't follow instructions, we have procedures to handle situations like this. Richard tilted his head slightly, his calm unnerving her more than any shouting could have. And I have procedures of my own, he said simply, tapping the side of his phone. On the other end, his assistant Anthony Garcia was already working. Anthony, Richard said quietly, I need you to call Daniel Martin at Horizon. Tell him what's happening on Flight 214. Have him ready when we land. Anthony's voice came through steady but tense. Already on it. Sir, this won't stand. Mary didn't like the quiet confidence in Richard's tone. You could see it in the way her jaw tightened. Nancy returned moments later with 2 security officers in dark uniforms trailing behind her. The sight of them set off another wave of whispers through the cabin. They're really calling security on him? Someone murmured behind me. One of the guards approached Richard cautiously, his voice low and even. Sir, we've been told there's a disturbance. Can we see your boarding pass? Please. Richard handed it over without hesitation. Along with his ID, the guard glanced at both, frowned, and then looked at Mary. He's in the right seat, the guard said flatly. Mary's face flushed red, but she pressed on anyway, her pride refusing to let go. It's not just about the seat, she insisted. We're trying to accommodate one of our platinum members. We need his cooperation. Richard leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his voice calm but firm. What you need, he said slowly, is to stop making assumptions about who belongs where. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Passengers began nodding, some whispering in agreement. A few even clapped softly, though the tension kept most people silent. Brian's camera captured everything, and I could see the reflection of the screen. Thousands of comments pouring in by the second. Name the airline! Fire her now! We're not letting this slide! Nancy shifted uncomfortably beside Mary, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes darting between the passengers and the phone cameras aimed at her. Lisa, meanwhile, had crossed her arms and was tapping her foot impatiently, clearly annoyed that she wasn't getting her way. Then, over the intercom, a voice broke through the tension. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please remain seated. We're addressing a situation in the first-class cabin. Gasps rippled through the rows. People were leaning into the aisles, phones raised, desperate to capture what would happen next. The cockpit door opened slowly, and I caught a glimpse of Captain William Moore stepping into the aisle, a tall man in his late 50s with graying hair and steady eyes. He carried himself with quiet authority. He scanned the cabin once, his gaze landing on Richard, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe even respect. He stepped closer, but before he could speak, Mary jumped in, desperate to reassert control. Captain, we have a passenger refusing to comply with instructions. He's disrupting the cabin, and we need to reseat him. The captain raised one hand, silencing her instantly. His voice was calm, steady, but there was steel underneath it. I'll handle this. Mary. She stepped back reluctantly, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting nervously at the passengers who were now openly filming her. The captain looked at Richard and said, Mr. Taylor, good to see you again. Didn't expect to find you in the middle of this. Murmurs rippled through the cabin at the sound of his name. Mary's jaw dropped slightly, her confidence faltering for the first time. Lisa leaned forward, confused. Wait, who is he? She whispered. But nobody answered her. Richard nodded at the captain, his voice low and even. Good to see you too. Bill, Just trying to keep my seat." The captain gave him a small smile, then turned back to the rest of the cabin, his voice carrying just enough authority to quiet the room. "We'll resolve this quickly," he said. Brian and Eric didn't stop recording for a second. Their TikTok video had already crossed 100,000 views, and Eric's X thread was trending nationally. The hashtags were blowing up. Hashtag Horizon Airlines, hashtag Respect First Class, hashtag Richard Taylor. The entire country was about to watch what happened next, but right there, in that cabin, on that Boeing 737, the power dynamic had already started to shift. None of us knew it yet, but this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was about to become a viral reckoning, one that would change Horizon Airlines forever. The captain took one deliberate step forward, his presence commanding the entire cabin without raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began calmly, "let's clear up some confusion." His gaze shifted from the tense faces of the passengers to Mary, whose arms were still folded tightly across her chest, then to Richard, who remained seated, composed, and unshaken. "Mr. Taylor," the captain said with deliberate weight, "I didn't expect to see you on this flight today." He paused for a beat, letting the name sink in. Around me, I heard whispers ripple through the cabin. "Taylor? Mr. Taylor?" Mary's brow furrowed, clearly thrown off by the captain's familiarity, while Nancy shifted uncomfortably, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. Lisa Wilson, leaning back in her plush seat, raised an eyebrow. "Who is he?" she muttered, but her voice carried far enough for several passengers to hear. Without missing a beat, the captain turned to the entire first-class cabin and spoke clearly, his words slicing through the tension like glass breaking. "This gentleman is Richard Taylor, the CEO of Horizon Airlines, and he owns 10% of this company." For a split second, there was silence. The kind of silence where you could hear the engines humming beneath your feet. And then the cabin erupted into gasps, murmurs, and stunned exclamations. Brian nearly dropped his phone before catching it again, muttering, "Oh my God, this just changed everything." Eric's fingers flew over his phone screen, his expression frozen in shock. Mary's face drained of color, her authority crumbling right in front of us. She stammered, I didn't know, sir. If I had known." But Richard raised a hand slightly, stopping her mid-sentence, his voice calm but firm. "That's exactly the point. Mary," he said, each word deliberate and controlled. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with dignity." Passengers murmured their agreement, several nodding, others recording from every angle. Someone whispered softly, "This is unbelievable." Lisa Wilson, clutching her $5,000 Gucci bag tightly now, as if it were a shield, cleared her throat and tried to recover her composure. "Mr. Taylor, I didn't realize." But Richard turned his head slowly toward her, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "You offered me $400 for a seat I paid $2,500 for," he said quietly, though everyone in first class could hear him. "That's not generosity. That's entitlement." Lisa's cheeks flushed crimson, and she sank back into her seat, avoiding everyone's gaze, her earlier arrogance evaporating into thin air. The captain stepped closer to Richard, placing a hand on the headrest of his seat, his tone respectful but firm. "Mr. Taylor, do you want me to handle this, or would you prefer to address it yourself?" Richard's response was immediate, his composure unshaken. "I'll handle it when we land. Bill, for now, let's get this flight in the air." The captain nodded, satisfied, then turned to Mary and Nancy. "Until then," he said sharply, "you will not speak another word to Mr. Taylor unless he speaks to you first. Am I understood?" Mary swallowed hard and nodded quickly, her earlier arrogance completely gone. Nancy, pale and tense, whispered, "Yes, Captain," Her voice barely audible. Brian whispered to Eric, "Did you hear that? He's the CEO. They tried to push him out." Eric shook his head slowly, his voice low and steady. "This is going to change everything for Horizon Airlines." I leaned back in my seat, realizing we weren't just watching a disagreement anymore. We were witnessing a moment that would ripple far beyond this plane. Meanwhile, Richard stayed composed, his calmness commanding the room more powerfully than any raised voice could. He glanced at Brian and Eric, giving a small nod of acknowledgement, and they nodded back, still filming, their cameras steady as the story unfolded. Across the aisle, Lisa Wilson's posture had shrunk. The confident, entitled woman from moments ago now sat rigid, clutching her bag with both hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. Passengers began whispering among themselves, some quietly celebrating Richard's composure, others shaking their heads at the way Mary had handled things. The captain, sensing the shift in energy, gave one final instruction before returning to the cockpit. "Everyone stay seated. We'll be departing shortly," as he disappeared behind the cockpit door. The cabin settled into a tense silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This one was heavier, thicker, carrying the weight of embarrassment, regret, and realization. Mary stood stiffly at the front of first class, her clipboard now clutched against her chest instead of being used like a weapon. Nancy stayed glued to her position near the galley, her eyes avoiding Richard completely. And yet, phones continued to record from every angle, lenses zoomed in on every reaction, because everyone on that plane understood one thing: this story wasn't staying inside the cabin. Richard pulled out his phone and called Anthony Garcia again, his assistant waiting on standby. "Anthony," he said calmly, "make sure Daniel Martin is at the gate when we land in Los Angeles, and tell him to be ready for a full debriefing." Anthony's voice came back sharp and focused. "Already taken care of." "Sir, I've briefed Daniel. He'll be waiting." Richard paused for a moment, exhaling slowly, as though centering himself amid the storm. "This isn't about making a scene," he said softly, almost to himself but loud enough for me to hear. "This is about accountability. Around me." Passengers exchanged looks, some nodding quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly everything had escalated. Mary's posture had collapsed entirely now, her pride, so sharp and unbending minutes ago, had melted into silent panic. Nancy whispered something to her, but Mary didn't respond. And yet, through all of it, Richard didn't gloat. He didn't grandstand. He didn't use his position to humiliate anyone. He sat there quietly, scrolling through his tablet, his composure speaking louder than any words could. That silence, his calm refusal to be shaken, was more powerful than any confrontation. Passengers who'd been skeptical moments ago now looked at him with newfound respect, nodding subtly as they passed glances among themselves. What none of us knew then was that this was only the beginning, because while the cabin was slowly settling into uneasy quiet, the outside world was preparing for what came next. Within minutes, calls were being made, statements were being drafted, and conversations about policy and conduct were already starting behind the scenes. A simple confrontation over a seat had transformed into something far greater, something no one on that flight would ever forget. Sitting there in seat 1A, Richard Taylor didn't raise his voice, didn't boast about his title, didn't flaunt his ownership. But in his silence, there was power. In his calm, there was dignity. And as the cameras continued rolling and passengers quietly processed what had just happened, one thing became clear to everyone watching. On that flight, in that moment, the balance of power had shifted completely. The real reckoning, however, was still waiting at LAX when the wheels touched down at Los Angeles International Airport. The tension inside that Boeing 737 was so thick you could almost hear it crackle in the air. Nobody was talking anymore. Phones were in silent mode. Cameras still recording. Passengers leaning slightly into the aisle, waiting to see what would happen when the cabin doors opened. Richard Taylor sat motionless in seat 1A, scrolling briefly through his tablet but not reading, his expression calm, unreadable. Mary Smith stood stiffly near the galley, her hands clasped so tightly behind her back that her knuckles had turned white. Nancy Hernandez, her assistant, lingered by the beverage cart, her head bowed, avoiding every glance sent her way. Lisa Wilson hadn't said a single word since the captain revealed Richard's identity, and now she sat quietly with her designer handbag clutched against her chest, her arrogance replaced by something that looked an awful lot like fear. The engines slowed, the cabin tilted slightly, and the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turned the silence into anticipation. The door clicked open, and sunlight from the jet bridge spilled into the cabin, sharp and bright. At the gate stood Daniel Martin, Horizon's director of operations, his silver hair perfectly combed but his expression grim. Beside him was Anthony Garcia, Richard's loyal assistant, tablet in hand, already reviewing emails, text alerts, and reports piling up by the minute. As Richard stood, he adjusted his jacket slowly, his movements precise, unhurried, almost deliberate, a quiet reminder to everyone watching that true power never needed to be loud. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring softly, "That's him. He owns part of the airline." Mary's shoulders stiffened as Richard approached the exit, and for a moment, it looked like she was going to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but before she could say a word, Daniel stepped inside the cabin, his voice low, measured, and impossible to ignore. "Mr. Taylor," he said with a respectful nod, "Anthony brought me up to speed. We're prepared to handle this immediately." Richard gave a faint nod, his eyes never leaving Mary and Nancy, who were now frozen where they stood. "Not here," Richard said quietly, his voice deep, steady, resonant enough that everyone around him heard. At the gate. The walk from the jet bridge into the terminal felt like a slow-motion parade. Passengers streamed behind Richard, whispering under their breath, holding their phones at discreet angles to capture every moment. The LAX concourse was alive with the sound of rolling suitcases, muffled boarding announcements, and, in the middle of it all, a growing circle of onlookers gathering around the gate where Daniel, Anthony, and security staff were waiting. Richard stepped into the open space, his presence commanding without effort. Mary and Nancy followed hesitantly, their steps small, their faces pale, while Lisa trailed behind them, her Gucci bag pressed tight against her side like a shield. Daniel cleared his throat, speaking not just to Richard but to everyone within earshot. "Mr. Taylor, I've reviewed the preliminary report. We'll begin an internal investigation immediately." Richard's expression didn't change, but his voice carried sharp authority when he finally spoke. "Daniel, this isn't just about me," he said calmly, each word measured, deliberate. "This is about what happens when bias takes precedence over service, when people are judged before they're even spoken to." A hush swept over the gathered crowd, his words cutting through the noise of the terminal as if the world outside had fallen silent. Lisa shifted uncomfortably, but Mary broke first, her voice cracking as she tried to explain. "Sir, I truly didn't know who you were. I was trying to accommodate a platinum member." Richard's gaze met hers, unwavering, and his reply was soft, but it carried weight that made her flinch. "You didn't need to know who I was." "Mary," he said firmly, his voice steady, "you just needed to remember who I am. A paying customer. A human being. That's all." The ripple of murmurs through the crowd was immediate, people exchanging knowing glances, some nodding quietly, others folding their arms as if absorbing a hard truth. Nancy spoke up next, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just following Mary's lead." Richard turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable but his tone neutral. "And what did that lead you to do?" "Nancy?" Her silence was answer enough. Daniel stepped forward, his hands clasped in front of him, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Taylor, I recommend we take this conversation to a private lounge," he suggested cautiously, his eyes flicking nervously between the growing crowd of passengers and the security officers nearby. But Richard shook his head slowly, his voice low yet absolute. "No," he said. "This happened in public. Daniel. It will be addressed in public." The weight of those words seemed to reverberate through the terminal, pulling even passing travelers to slow their pace and glance toward the commotion. A few more phones went up, tiny red recording lights blinking steadily. And still, Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mary," Richard said, turning to face the lead flight attendant directly. "You've been with Horizon for 15 years. Tell me, in all that time, has anyone ever trained you to treat some passengers better than others?" Mary hesitated, her throat tightening, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "No, sir," she admitted. "But," Richard cut her off gently but firmly. "Then you made a choice," he said quietly. "A choice based on assumptions and appearances." Mary's lips parted as though to respond, but nothing came out. Her jaw tightened, her chin trembled slightly, and her gaze dropped to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the distant echo of rolling luggage and the low hum of airport announcements. Anthony stepped forward subtly, handing Richard his phone. The screen lit up with messages, emails, and voicemails from journalists already seeking statements. Richard didn't look at the screen. Instead, he passed the phone back to Anthony without glancing at it and addressed Daniel again. "You know what needs to be done," Richard said calmly, his tone even but resolute. "I expect your decision by the end of the day." Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "Understood, Mr. Taylor," he said quietly. The gathered passengers around us watched in silence, their expressions shifting between awe and vindication. Lisa, standing slightly off to the side, finally lowered her Gucci bag and cleared her throat softly, her voice shaky but audible. "Mr. Taylor, I owe you an apology," she began hesitantly. "It was thoughtless of me to assume anything about you." Richard's eyes met hers briefly, his tone polite but distant. "Apology noted," he said softly, then turned back to Daniel and Anthony. "Let's move forward. The entire confrontation. From the moment Richard stepped off the plane to this final exchange. Couldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes. Yet it carried the weight of something far bigger. You could feel it in the way people were watching, in the quiet awe that followed his every word, in the way even seasoned airport staff stood frozen near the gate, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces solemn. Richard Taylor didn't have to shout to command the room. He didn't have to threaten, or explain, or defend. His presence, steady, quiet, absolute, did all of that for him, and though he said little, his message was impossible to miss. Respect isn't earned by title or wealth. It's owed to every single person, every single time. As Anthony guided Richard toward the private lounge to prepare for what came next, Daniel turned back toward Mary and Nancy, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he said simply, his voice low but firm. "We'll speak shortly." And just like that, the crowd began to scatter, whispers trailing behind them like an echo of the lesson they'd just witnessed. But for Mary and Nancy, It wasn't over. The real consequences were only minutes away. The atmosphere inside the private lounge at LAX was heavy, thick with silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel deliberate. Richard Taylor sat at the center of the room, composed and still, his calm presence radiating a quiet authority that needed no explanation. Across from him stood Daniel Martin, Horizon's Director of Operations, holding a slim folder in his hand, his jaw tight, his expression grave. Behind Daniel, two members of Horizon's legal and HR teams waited silently, tablets in hand, ready to document what was about to happen. To Richard's right, Anthony Garcia stood poised, arms crossed, scanning emails and messages streaming into his phone. On the far side of the room, Mary Smith and Nancy Hernandez sat side by side, their once confident postures reduced to nervous tension. Mary's shoulders were hunched, her fingers twisting a napkin until it shredded between her hands, while Nancy kept her gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Lisa Wilson sat a little further away, her expensive handbag resting on her lap, her lips pressed tightly together, her earlier arrogance now fully replaced by regret and discomfort. Daniel cleared his throat softly, the sound carrying across the stillness of the room, and began in a low, measured voice. "Mr. Taylor," he said, "I've completed the review based on witness statements, video evidence, and staff reports from Flight 214. He paused briefly, glancing toward Mary and Nancy before returning his gaze to Richard. "As of this moment, Horizon Airlines is terminating the employment of both Mary Smith and Nancy Hernandez, effective immediately." The words landed like a hammer on the table, sharp and final. Mary gasped audibly, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This job, this is 15 years of my life. You can't just—" But Daniel cut her off gently, his voice calm but unyielding. "Mary, we can, and we must. The company's values are not optional. What happened on that flight was unacceptable." Nancy finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her voice small, breaking on the edges of every syllable. I was following orders," she murmured, her words barely more than a whisper. Richard shifted slightly in his chair, his expression steady but his voice firm as he responded. "Nancy," he said evenly, "following orders does not excuse disregarding someone's dignity. Every single passenger deserves respect. Every single time." The silence that followed was deep, almost suffocating. Lisa Wilson shifted uncomfortably, setting her handbag down beside her and finally speaking in a soft, hesitant voice. "Mr. Taylor," she said quietly, "I'm sorry for the things I said on that flight. It was thoughtless and wrong." Richard turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze with a calm, measured expression. "Ms. Wilson," he replied, his tone polite but distant. "Apologies are important, but accountability matters more. Words have weight. Actions leave marks. What we choose to do next defines who we are." Lisa swallowed hard, nodding once before falling silent again. Daniel set the folder down on the table and straightened his jacket, his voice louder now as he addressed Mary and Nancy directly. "You'll be escorted from the premises today," he said firmly, gesturing toward the two HR representatives behind him. "Your employment with Horizon ends here. Security will collect your company IDs and uniforms. You'll receive formal documentation regarding your termination later this afternoon." Mary's breathing grew shallow, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of her seat. "Please," she whispered, "just give me a chance to explain." Richard finally spoke again, his voice low but resolute, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mary, I heard everything I needed to hear back on that plane," he said steadily. You didn't just mishandle a situation. You undermined the very values this company stands for. Horizon Airlines carries millions of passengers a year, and every one of them trusts us to treat them with dignity. Today, that trust was broken. The weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Nancy bowed her head again, silent tears slipping down her cheeks as one of the HR representatives gently placed a box of tissues on the table in front of her. Lisa shifted further back in her chair, avoiding everyone's gaze, while Anthony remained quietly focused on his phone, silently forwarding statements to media outlets and preparing for the inevitable fallout. Outside the glass walls of the lounge, passengers were still moving through the terminal, oblivious to the quiet reckoning unfolding just steps away. Daniel turned back to Richard, his tone respectful but tense. "Mr. Taylor," he said, "would you like to make an official statement to the press now? Or wait until we've finalized the internal review?" Richard shook his head slightly, his voice calm but firm. "No press conferences today," he said evenly. "This isn't about headlines. It's about setting a standard. Actions will speak louder than any statement." Daniel nodded, understanding immediately, and stepped back slightly as Richard stood slowly from his chair. The quiet authority in his movements commanded the room without effort. He turned, facing Mary and Nancy one final time, his voice steady but not unkind. "I don't take pleasure in this," he said softly, his words deliberate, weighty. "But leadership means making hard choices. This isn't just about you. It's about every passenger, every employee, and every future flight. We must do better. All of us." Mary's shoulders collapsed inward, her eyes glistening, while Nancy nodded faintly, unable to speak, for a long moment. No one moved. The silence was heavy but full of meaning, as though everyone understood that this was more than just a personnel decision. It was a turning point. Richard finally turned back to Daniel and Anthony, his voice lower now but carrying an unmistakable finality. "Make sure Horizon never forgets this day," he said calmly. "Update our policies, retrain our staff, and ensure that respect is non-negotiable." Anthony nodded firmly, already drafting the framework for new guidelines, while Daniel tapped his folder against the table gently, signaling the HR team to proceed. The two representatives stepped forward, inviting Mary and Nancy to stand. Mary hesitated for just a moment before finally rising to her feet, her posture tense, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. Nancy followed silently, her head bowed, her breathing uneven, as the two women were quietly escorted from the lounge. The sound of their footsteps against the polished floor seemed louder than any words that could have been spoken. Lisa Wilson remained seated, her gaze fixed on the floor, her once commanding presence completely diminished. For a moment, the room was still again, the weight of the decision settling over everyone. Richard straightened his jacket, his expression calm, his focus unbroken. He glanced at Anthony, then Daniel, and spoke softly but decisively. "This is only the beginning. Let's make sure Horizon Airlines lives up to its promise." And with that, Richard Taylor walked out of the lounge, the quiet strength of his presence leaving an unmistakable mark on everyone who had witnessed what had just unfolded. The following morning, the entire headquarters of Horizon Airlines in Los Angeles was buzzing like a storm had swept through overnight. The events on Flight 214 had set off a chain reaction that no one in the company could ignore. In the executive conference room on the 27th floor, a full emergency board meeting had been called before sunrise. The air was tense, thick with the weight of urgency. Around the long glass table, directors, executives, and department heads sat in silence, their faces pale as they scrolled through endless reports, emails, and statements from furious customers. Screens on the walls flashed non-stop updates, showing passenger testimonies, internal incident reports, and news articles dissecting every detail of what had happened on that plane. At the head of the table sat Richard Taylor, silent, composed, but his presence dominating the room without a single word. Daniel Martin sat to his right, shuffling documents nervously, while Anthony Garcia typed quickly on his tablet, coordinating statements and policy proposals in real time. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying the kind of weight that silences an entire room. Yesterday, he began, Horizon Airlines failed its customers. And when we fail them, we fail our purpose. That ends today. The boardroom was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the air vents overhead. Richard leaned forward slightly, his fingers laced together on the table, his eyes sharp and unwavering. This is not just about one incident, he continued. It's about culture. It's about training. It's about accountability at every level. Several directors shifted uncomfortably, some nodding slowly, others avoiding his gaze. Richard gestured toward Anthony, who projected a new set of slides onto the main screen. Starting today, Richard said firmly, we are launching the Horizon Respect Initiative, a company-wide reform program focused on 3 things: mandatory diversity and inclusion training, a zero-tolerance policy on discrimination, and a complete review of our customer service protocols. The announcement sent ripples around the table, Anthony added. We're also establishing an independent passenger advocacy council, giving travelers direct influence over our policies moving forward. Daniel finally spoke, his voice soft but certain. This will change everything. Richard, it'll take time, but it's the right move. Richard nodded once but said nothing more, his silence as commanding as his words. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, the ripple effects were already reaching Mary Smith and Nancy Hernandez. That same morning, Mary sat in a small, dimly lit office across town, speaking with a labor attorney, her voice low, trembling. I gave them 15 years, she said, her fingers clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee she hadn't touched. I made a mistake. Yes, but to lose everything in one day. The attorney listened carefully but offered little comfort, explaining softly that video evidence and witness statements made her case nearly impossible to fight. Across the city, Nancy sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling endlessly through job postings, her face pale and swollen from crying. She had already received a call from a regional airline offering her a lower-paying position, starting in 3 weeks, though devastated. She understood this was her only way forward. I'll start over, she whispered quietly to herself, her voice steady despite the tears. Lisa Wilson's life, however, took an entirely different turn. Within 48 hours, her name began circulating across private real estate investor circles, not because of her deals, but because of her words. Several longtime clients quietly withdrew from pending agreements, citing reputation concerns. Local business forums buzzed with discussions about professionalism, entitlement, and consequences. Lisa, usually the woman at the center of every gala and networking event, canceled all her appearances indefinitely. For the first time in years, her carefully curated image had cracked, and no designer handbag could cover the damage. Back at Horizon's headquarters, Anthony drafted a formal letter addressed to every employee, from senior executives to ground crew, outlining the changes Richard had ordered. From this moment forward, the letter read, respect is non-negotiable. Every passenger, every employee, every single person who steps onto a Horizon flight must be treated with dignity, without exception. The letter went viral internally, shared between employees with both shock and pride. Several flight attendants replied within minutes, expressing gratitude for finally addressing long-standing cultural issues inside the company. One senior crew member wrote back simply, "It's about time to rebuild trust." Richard personally ordered that every passenger from Flight 214 be invited to a private meeting at the Horizon Training Center in Los Angeles. 1 week later, they gathered in a sleek, modern hall with soft lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. Brian Allen and Eric Green were there, seated side by side, their phones resting on the table for once, watching Richard intently. Lisa Wilson was invited too, but declined, preferring silence to further public exposure. Richard stood at the front of the room. No microphone needed, his voice steady and clear. "You were witnesses to something that never should have happened," he said, meeting each pair of eyes slowly, deliberately. "Horizon failed you, and for that, I take responsibility. But this is not the end of the story. We are changing, and I need your help to make sure we never forget why." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "When someone steps onto one of our flights, they're trusting us with more than their safety. They're trusting us with their dignity. That is sacred." Several passengers nodded quietly, some exchanging soft murmurs of agreement, others visibly moved by the sincerity in his tone. As Richard wrapped up the meeting, Anthony distributed a small booklet outlining the new Horizon Respect initiative, complete with training schedules, reporting tools, and accountability measures. Brian leaned over to Eric, whispering, "I didn't think I'd ever see an airline take something this seriously." Eric nodded, his voice low but certain. "Richard's different. He's not just talking, he's changing things." Later that week, Horizon Airlines rolled out its first company-wide mandatory training sessions. Thousands of employees logged in across the country, watching carefully designed modules on empathy, unconscious bias, and customer experience standards. At the same time, Richard held closed-door sessions with department heads, emphasizing that accountability didn't end with frontline staff. Leaders set the tone. He told them firmly, "If you can't embody our values, you can't lead here." There were no arguments. No one dared. By the end of the first month, customer satisfaction scores had risen, and several longtime loyal passengers shared stories of improved service on social media. Employees across the company began sharing their own reflections, some admitting they had never fully understood how small actions, a tone of voice, a passing remark, a careless assumption, could shape a passenger's entire experience. Richard read every single report, every single email, often late into the night, responding personally to those who had struggled with similar incidents. For him, this wasn't just business, it was personal. And yet, despite all the changes, Richard remained the same man who sat quietly in seat 1A, refusing to move, not because of pride, but because of principle. His calm that day had carried further than any angry outburst ever could, and people across the company knew it. They weren't just following orders, they were following his example, inside Horizon Airlines. Something deeper than policy had shifted. A culture had begun to change, one decision, one flight, one story at a time. But Richard knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something larger, something that would define the company's future. Because from that day forward, Horizon Airlines would no longer simply promise better service. It would live it. And for Richard Taylor, the man who turned a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change, there was no turning back. 6 months later, the world looked very different for Horizon Airlines, and even more so for Richard Taylor. On a bright afternoon in Los Angeles, the company hosted its first-ever Passenger Respect Summit, an event designed to showcase Horizon's transformation and reinforce its renewed commitment to customer dignity. Inside the Grand Hall, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the runway, where sleek aircraft sat gleaming in the distance. Executives, employees, journalists, and frequent flyers filled every seat, their voices hushed as they waited for Richard to speak. When he stepped onto the stage, dressed in a simple navy suit and open-collared white shirt. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just a quiet, collective anticipation, the kind reserved for someone whose actions have already spoken louder than any words. Richard paused at the podium, scanning the room slowly before he began, his voice steady, deep, and calm. 6 months ago, he said, Horizon Airlines failed on a fundamental level. We failed to uphold the basic principle that every passenger deserves dignity and respect. That moment became a mirror, not just for this company, but for me. The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. I made a promise that day. Richard continued, not just to myself, but to every traveler who places their trust in us, that what happened on Flight 214 would never happen again. He gestured toward a large screen behind him, where slides displayed the results of the Horizon Respect Initiative. Since its launch, he explained, we've retrained every single employee, from executives to ground staff, on empathy, cultural awareness, and customer service. Over 42,000 employees have completed the program so far, and we've established an independent passenger advocacy council to ensure your voices guide our policies. We've changed more than procedures. We've changed our culture. Murmurs of approval rippled quietly through the audience. Anthony Garcia, seated in the front row, glanced at the live survey data on his tablet. Passenger satisfaction ratings had jumped by 37% in 6 months. Complaints had dropped sharply, and employee retention had improved for the first time in 5 years. Horizon had gone from being criticized in the media to being recognized as a leader in customer experience reform. But Richard didn't smile, didn't celebrate. His tone remained grounded, almost introspective. Success isn't measured by press headlines or numbers on a screen, he said softly. It's measured by the small, human moments, by the way we greet a nervous passenger boarding their first flight, by how we treat someone carrying more weight in their heart than in their luggage, by how we listen before we judge. Several people in the audience nodded, some visibly moved by the sincerity in his tone. Brian Allen and Eric Green, seated side by side, exchanged a glance, remembering that tense day in first class when the world felt like it was holding its breath. For them, this summit wasn't just a corporate presentation. It was closure. Across town. Mary Smith sat alone in a modest coffee shop, sipping a lukewarm drink as she scrolled through her tablet. Horizon's summit streamed live on nearly every platform, and Mary couldn't look away, no matter how much it hurt, after losing her position. She'd taken time to reflect, to confront years of habits and assumptions she had never questioned. She had recently started volunteering at a local community center, helping young job seekers prepare for interviews, teaching them lessons she wished she'd learned sooner. Her life looked nothing like it had before, but for the first time in years, Mary felt as though she was rebuilding herself, slowly, quietly, one choice at a time. Nancy Hernandez, meanwhile, had relocated to Phoenix, where she'd accepted a job with a small regional airline. The pay was lower, the flights shorter, and the resources fewer. But Nancy approached her new role with humility and purpose. She carried a small card in her uniform pocket, handwritten with 4 words she never wanted to forget. Listen, respect, protect, serve. She smiled more these days, spoke softly to nervous passengers, and silently vowed she would never let another traveler feel the way Richard Taylor had felt that day. Lisa Wilson's journey was different, once the image of prestige in Los Angeles real estate. Lisa had watched her reputation unravel in the weeks following Flight 214. Clients withdrew contracts, partnerships dissolved, and industry circles grew cold toward her name. But instead of retreating into anger, Lisa chose to confront her mistakes. She sold several properties, downsized her lifestyle, and invested time in cultural awareness and sensitivity training. Though her social calendar remained empty, she found a strange kind of peace in rediscovering her values, a quiet realization that worth is not measured by handbags or status, but by character. Back at Horizon, Richard's influence continued to ripple far beyond the company. Other airlines quietly began adopting similar initiatives, and several major carriers approached Richard for guidance on overhauling their own training programs. Legislators in Washington cited Horizon's transformation during hearings on consumer rights and workplace diversity, using it as an example of how corporations could evolve without federal mandates. Richard, however, remained focused on his core mission, ensuring every passenger on every Horizon flight felt seen, heard, and respected. Near the end of the summit, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. She introduced herself as a first-time flyer who had been on Flight 214, seated just a few rows behind first class. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Taylor," she said softly, "that day, I watched how calm you were, even when people around you weren't. It taught me something I'll never forget. That real strength doesn't shout. It listens." The room was silent for a long moment, her words settling deep into the space between breaths. Richard gave her a small nod, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you. That's a lesson I learned the hard way." 2. As the summit concluded, Richard stepped down from the stage and walked slowly toward the back of the hall, shaking hands with employees, passengers, and even competitors who had come to witness Horizon's transformation. Anthony handed him a tablet showing live feedback from the event, thousands of positive comments pouring in from viewers around the country. But Richard barely glanced at the screen. For him, the numbers mattered less than the people in front of him. The conversations he was having face to face, the trust slowly being rebuilt one interaction at a time. Outside the glass walls, a Horizon Airlines jet lifted gracefully into the sky, sunlight glinting off its polished wings. Richard paused, watching it ascend, and felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over him. The road ahead would still hold challenges, mistakes would still be made, and there would always be more work to do. But for the first time in a long time, he believed they were on the right path. Walking out of the summit hall, Richard turned to Anthony and Daniel, his voice low but certain. "This isn't just about Horizon," he said firmly. "It's about setting an example. Respect is not a slogan, it's a promise." Anthony nodded silently, while Daniel let out a slow breath, the weight of the past 6 months finally lifting, replaced by something steadier: hope. That day, as the sun dipped lower over Los Angeles, Horizon Airlines stood transformed, not perfect, but better, stronger, and more human than it had ever been. And Richard Taylor, the man who refused to give up his seat, had become something more than a CEO. He had become a symbol, not of power or wealth, but of dignity, accountability, and quiet strength. Because in the end, it wasn't the title that defined him, it was the way he carried it. Thank you for watching this emotional story. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us.